Starting with a little bit of housekeeping. Obviously, if you enjoy these videos, please do give it a thumbs up. It'll help so much with the YouTube algorithm. Obviously, being a small channel, that goes a really long way. Also, if there's a fixture that you're particularly interested that is upcoming, or even maybe previous seasons or something, I don't really mind. Let me know down below in the comments and I'll try and get to it at some point. So with that, on to Manchester United. So typically Manchester United sought to use the creativity of Ella Toone, typically holding the number 9 role but really playing a false 9. You can see her here highlighted, dropping a little bit deeper, trying to get into a pocket of space. This scenario is just off a Manchester United corner actually, which is why the shape is the way it is. It gives a good example of how Ella Toone wanted to play and the kind of runs that Manchester United were looking to make. Again, this was off a corner, but Battier being relatively high in the left, almost in left wing position, and having instead Galton as the centre forward was a regular thing earlier on in the game. Highlighted in this top right hand corner of the picture is where Ella Toone is, the actual centre forward. So Manchester United were really looking to try and exploit the relatively high line and slow wide centre backs of Chelsea, that being Eriksen and Millie Bright. They swapped over in this scenario, but regardless, I don't think it worked that well just because of Carter playing as the central centre-back. So typically Carter actually was playing more as a right-sided centre-back, or at least last season she was. But I think having her here as a central centre-back kind of negated the whole idea of having players run beyond the wide centre-backs and try and isolate themselves against the slower wide centre-backs of Chelsea, because Carter's relatively quick, so it allows them to be able to kind of stop counters, or at least cover counters a lot better. And here at the final phase of this attack, you have Battier dribble inside. Despite the scoreline, I think Battier played relatively well, but you have her drive inside and eventually she takes a shot. But here again, in the right, very far away from the action, is Ella Toone, just looking to try and pick up a little bit of space. She's not really trying to get involved where all of the action is. She wants to be able to kind of pick her spot, pick where she can influence the game. Okay, so we can praise Ella Toone all we want and, Battier, but you have to get the ball to them. And I definitely think Manchester United really struggled at that. At times they were able to beat the press, so this being one of those scenarios. So Chelsea were typically set up to press in like a 5-2-3 or a 5-2-1-2. Against this 5-2-3 shape, Manchester United were playing a 2-3 deep or a 2-4 deep. So your centre midfielders were typically kind of together. They were being marked and marshalled quite well, I think, by the press. It was very difficult for Manchester United to play it out to them. Chelsea were very patient initially when Manchester United had the ball with their centre-backs and their goalkeeper, and would only really pounce once Manchester United passed the ball out towards the wide spaces, trying to just collapse in on that space. So you have basically everyone flowed over to that side to kind of just really congest the space and test Manchester United's passing IQ, as well as close control and general movement under pressure. So in this scenario, Manchester United are able to play up the wing and are able to play it into Ella Toone, who's dropped off. She was tracked on occasion by whether it was Carter or whoever, and given the disadvantage of a press is once you're beaten, you're relatively light on numbers at the back. Manchester United did well, I think, to try and achieve these kind of situations. Again, another scenario where Manchester United are able to beat the Chelsea press. Again, set up in that 5-2-3, staying relatively narrow initially. You have a lot of intensity out of those forwards when they do press, and especially when the ball goes out towards a wide player, so we're thinking a fullback or wide midfielder. So unlike in the previous example, when they keep it on the deck, in this scenario they fire it over the press and they play it into Toone, who's dropping off. Just as I mentioned in the other scenario, Carter is tracking her. So in the previous examples, you only see Toone and you don't see the other two forwards in Hansel and Galton, because they're actually higher up the pitch, looking to try and stretch and just push the centre-backs, the defensive line of Chelsea, further by making runs in behind. In this scenario, by this time, Manchester United have changed attack and are instead using Toone as a CAM, a more potentially natural role, and have Russo, who's going to stretch the line, in her stead. So instead, Toone wants to try and pick up spaces kind of towards this spot here in the top right hand corner as Chelsea press. This is a pretty good example of Manchester United's 2-4 relatively deep versus the Chelsea press with kind of like a 5-2-3 again, but you have Ingle who's been tracking Hayley Ladd. So Hayley Ladd is playing at this point as more of the CDM for Manchester United, whereas Katie Zellem is playing a little bit higher, trying to support the creativity of Toone. Also, let's point out the fact that Harder is pressing here. So she's tracked Katie Zellem whilst you've had Fran Kirby go towards the ball. So whilst Kirby goes and presses Thorstad here and leaves Battier free, then you're going to have Harder move from her position, tracking Zellem, to go and press against Battier. So as this play develops, we see where Toone has picked up a little bit of space just in behind the centre midfield of Chelsea, who've obviously tried to support the press. Because of her positioning, it makes it a little bit awkward for Chelsea. Here you have Bright rushing out to try and slow down Toone, just make sure she can't get her head up and play a quality ball for the runners for Manchester United, one of which being Galton over here. So whilst I've mentioned a couple of the more elaborate ways, I guess, that Manchester United try to play through or over Chelsea, I do think it would be a miss and maybe a bit biased if I didn't point out that Chelsea's press was really, really good against Manchester United. Often out of choice, Manchester United look to go long to try and exploit the pace of their wide forwards in Hansen and Galton, whilst you also have Toone dropping off as those guys stretch the play. With this style of play, it's very hit or miss. If you misjudge the flight of your pass, it just flies over whoever you're passing it to and goes straight towards Katrin Berger, who greedily just gobbled up most of these passes, or the pass just went straight out of play and it was Chelsea's. So often I'd say that Chelsea didn't have to defend actively, they just had to wait for Manchester United to kick the ball long and get it a little bit wrong. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit more about the Chelsea press. We've already talked about the fact that they typically waited for the ball to be passed out towards a fullback before fully engaging. In this scenario, we have Fran Kirby, who's pressing towards the goalkeeper, making sure that she can't really rest on her laurels. Similarly, trying to put pressure on the other Manchester United players, we have Leopold here, as well as also having Fran Kirby, who's curving her run, so that makes it a little bit more difficult for whoever's on the ball to be able to judge. So they have one picture when they look up and they have this feeling of the direction of where that player is going, but then because of the curved run, it makes it difficult to then know where the final destination is actually going to be when you then look up again after you've kicked the ball. Also, due to the proximity and intensity of Chelsea's press, they were often able to arrive at the Manchester United centre midfielders as they received the ball. So in this scenario, Ertz plays the ball into Greenan, who already has Leopold's maybe a yard or two off her, and Zellem on the other side is maybe 4 yards or so away from Harder. So you see that Greenan is going to have an issue immediately. She has to play it first time, but she takes a touch and it's not the greatest touch. It doesn't allow her to immediately then maybe stab it off to Zellem or hit it wide to Blundell or maybe back into Mannion. So immediately Leopold was able to get the ball. Okay, so I just want to mention what Arsenal did, I think, better than Manchester United did in this scenario. So Chelsea played, I think, a relatively similar press against Arsenal, and Arsenal generally play a relatively similar setup out of the back. Of course, this was from open play, so it's a little bit different from having a short goal kick, but regardless, you didn't have, for Arsenal, both of their centre midfielders quite as close as they are here for Manchester United. So Zellem and Gruden are way too close. They can really easily be got at by Harder and Leopold in this scenario. So in the case of Arsenal, Manon would be over here instead. So rather than where Gruden is right now, we'd think that Manon would be here instead. And instead of having Battier quite as deep as she is here, she'd be considerably higher up the pitch. Or she would stay deeper, but Blundell would go. So for me, part of the way that Arsenal were able to beat the press was by really stretching the pitch, really forcing Chelsea to have to cover a lot of ground to be able to press every one of Arsenal's players deep, but then also have the option long when they needed it. Of course, having Iwabuchi also kind of tucking in as almost like a left attacking midfielder, left-hand sided 8, made it a little bit easier for Arsenal to be able to play out the back and kind of disrupt G's side of the press. So G would be G had a relatively similar role or position, I guess, to what Leopold is playing in this game, but G can't track her running generally, I think, as well as Leopold can when it comes to pressing. And Iwabuchi's position makes that a little bit more awkward for her. She doesn't know exactly who to go and press. But obviously in this scenario, we're going to have Galton a lot higher up the pitch, probably occupying one of the centre-backs. She's, not as much of a problem during this phase of the press, and that's a little bit of an issue. I should mention, obviously, Arsenal went ahead in that game, so could sit back too, so that does help. Okay, so we're going to have a look at Chelsea's 5-2-1-2 press. I thought it was really important that they made the substitutions that they did. They brought on fresh legs in positions where players will get tired. And that goes back to what I was just talking about with regards to Arsenal beating Chelsea's press and how they really stretched the pitch to tire out the wing backs of Chelsea, to tire out the centre midfielders of Chelsea, to tire out the forwards. So in this game, Chelsea did not make the same mistake. They brought on fresh legs in those positions where there has to be a lot of high intensity pressing. So forwards, I guess maybe CAM, if you count what Fleming and Spencer were playing as CAM, and then also your wing back positions too. I wouldn't say that the system was too different, except obviously instead of having your 5-2-3 where you have a centre forward and in Kerr higher up the pitch, in this scenario you'd say maybe it's a little bit more conservative because you have Spencer tracking Hayley Ladd, the CDM for Manchester United. So on to Chelsea's attack, and I'd say that they had two variations out of the back. Both were 2-3s, so we're thinking two centre-backs and then a CDM and the full-backs, and then of course Harder's dropping deeper to try and support this build-up as well. Against this, Manchester United typically tried a 4-2-3-1 press. I think they were a little bit passive when it came to the press, especially if you compare it to how aggressive Chelsea were, of course. So despite the fact that Chelsea are playing a back five, they actually moved Jess Carter from central centre-back into a left centre-back position when they're playing out at the back, with Millie Bright as the right-sided centre-back. Manchester United, trying to avoid being played through, were trying to keep their wide midfielders and CAM and the rest of their midfield relatively narrow during the press, waiting for the ball to be played out towards a fullback during this phase of the play and then going and pressing them. I think it's important here to just mention the movement of Leopold's. So she's being tracked by Staniforth here, and this dropping deeper, offering herself as an option, draws Staniforth out and it creates spaces elsewhere on the pitch for Chelsea. This was a role that was played by Leopold, Ingle and also Carter. In the following phases of that same play, Manchester United obviously rush across, they try and have their fullbacks press towards the relatively high fullbacks / wing backs. Big thing for me, I think, is that Chelsea were really happy to go long and play percentages. So yes, they were going to move Manchester United's press around, but they did not care about holding possession at all. They would happily kick it long and see what Manchester United would do with it. Would they make a mistake once they were in possession with it? Which often Manchester United were happily to oblige. Okay, so this is the second variation that I was mentioning, and we talked a little bit about the fluidity of Leopold's, Ingle and Carter. So again, I'd say that we still have two centre-backs and a 3 with a CDM, except now your CDM is actually just Carter rather than Ingle or Leopold. And obviously this kind of movement, in the same way that we mentioned with just awkward positioning of the likes of Iwabuchi when Arsenal played Chelsea earlier in the season, just makes it just that bit more difficult for you to be able to track. So I really like this addition to the Chelsea build-up out of the back. So this being the next phase of play, and you can see Kerr has dropped a little bit deeper. So Kerr and Kirby were playing as wide forwards. They were really wide and separate from each other, almost wide of the Manchester United fullback, so that then they could potentially combine with their wing backs when wing backs get up to support, and also of course Harder constantly running in those half spaces too. To that point, you can see Harder here just behind the midfield line of the Manchester United press. This is a good example of Chelsea being very happy to just kick it long. Obviously at this point they're well ahead, there's not really any chance of Manchester United getting back in this game, and they were just happy to play the probabilities. Of course, and when you have the likes of Harder, who had an absolutely stunning individual goal in this game to try and bring the ball down, you've always got a chance. Both teams have made various substitutions. Chelsea are still building up in that second variation, so Jess Carter has started roughly around here. I think in more of a CDM than a centre-back role, because she's closer to the Manchester United half than the Manchester United centre-forward. One of those substitutions was Hayley Ladd, who in this scenario is part of a 4-1-4-1 press. So she's tracked Ingle, you're having Zellum track Fleming. Regardless of change in shape, I do think they reverted back to the 4-2-3-1 eventually, but I don't think it made that much of a difference. They still were relatively passive, didn't get that close to the ball, and Chelsea were really happy to just kick it long if you ever did get close to the ball. Okay, so in this scenario, we've got Chelsea switching the ball after drawing Manchester United's press towards one side. You've got Guru Wrighton, who, as I said, was, I think, a key means of getting up the pitch. They switch the ball to her here, and then she's just able to drive. She was really great at this throughout the game. Obviously, she's helped out by the fact that the Manchester United fullback has wanted to rush up to her. So if she's able to take a relatively good touch and kind of just hit it beyond the Manchester United fullback, then she kind of has an advantage of momentum. Also, with the fact that Chelsea are playing really wide forwards, it means that when the Manchester United fullback goes out, that now means that the Chelsea forward is going to be isolated against the Manchester United centre-back, which is a favourable matchup. Of course, this is Chelsea, so if they do want to turn it on, they can. You've got Harder dropping between the lines or just behind the midfield line of the Manchester United press again. You've got Grun heavily committed to trying to press Ingle, but Ingle does her with a really sharp turn after receiving the ball from, I think it was Bright in this case. With that, Manchester United's press is beaten, and Chelsea have just a ton of space to be able to work with. Of course, in this scenario, Manchester United are forced, just due to positional superiority, to back off, and you see what I mean by the wide forwards. We have Kirby here on the left-hand side, whereas on the right-hand side over here, we have Kurt. Yeah, and this happened a number of times, and with Chelsea having the wing-backs that they do, they were trying to get forward and really support, so we can see that here with Charles, and then on the other side with Wright, and she's typically trying to get up as well. So this was kind of an issue throughout a lot of the game, and I think this is a really good example of the problem that Manchester United faced due to the formation and style that Chelsea play. So Battier here has really nothing that she can do. She can't step out, because if she does, she potentially could expose both herself as well as also her slower centre-back in Thoris Detier. There's certain fullbacks who wouldn't have taken as conservative a position as Battier here did. For example, Ashley Neville of Tottenham would probably be a yard or two across just to her left hand side. Potentially, I mean, we saw what Harder did earlier in this game, potentially allowing Harder to be able to run inside and score another worldie. So I think Battier has taken a really good position, but she doesn't really have much options, and this was kind of the scenario where you have numerical advantage for Chelsea out in those wide spaces. You've got the relatively slow centre midfielders in both Zellum and Grunen, obviously hard-working, highly talented, but relatively slow. So when Chelsea were able to break in the way that they did with the rapid players that they had in those wide spaces, whether it's Kirby, Wrighton, Charles, Harder, you've got a serious problem, especially when Harder's trying to underlap your fullback, whilst also you have Wrighton and Kirby running around in that space, or Kerr running around in that space as well. Okay, so thank you for watching. This was a really fun match to watch, despite being a Manchester United fan. If you enjoyed watching this video, please give it a thumbs up. Also leave a comment. What do you think Manchester United could have done better? Do you think, like me, that it was just a case of you can still build out of the back, but you probably should have been tweaking the way you built up, just to throw a bit of randomness into your patterns and also make it more awkward for Chelsea's press? But with that, we're out.